Hello, everyone. Happy Sunday. Hello. I am Erin Christovale, the full curator here at the Hammer Museum, and we're really excited to be in conversation today about the life and legacy of Bob Thompson. This program is on the occasion of our exhibition that's currently going on upstairs and is open until January, called Bob Thompson, This House Is Mine. The Hammer is the fourth and final destination of this touring exhibition, and I wanted to give a brief shout out to the organizing curator, who I believe is here today, Diana Tuit. So can we just give Diana a round of applause? Today I have the pleasure of being in conversation with two brilliant thinkers who I think will both contribute really interesting views and ideas on Thompson's work. Each of us will be giving a short individual presentation, followed by a panel conversation and a brief Q&A. I also wanted to note that after the program, there will be coffee and tea and cookies outside if you guys need your sugar fix after some deep intellectual processing. And I also wanted to shout out to our public programs department for making this possible, our AV department for hooking us up today, and also our communications department that will be filming the event today. So thank you to all Hammer staff that make programs like this possible. So I'm going to introduce Ashon and Dr. Kellie Jones, and we will start our presentations. Ashon Crawley is a writer, artist, and teacher exploring the intersection of performance, Blackness, queerness, and spirituality. Associate Professor of Religious Studies in African American and African Studies at the University of Virginia, he is author of Black Pentecostal Breath, The Aesthetics of Possibility, and The Lonely Letters. He is currently working on a book about Black social life, a book about the Hammond B3 organ, the Black Church, and sexuality, and a short story collection. Founder of the Otherwise Arts Lab, an integrative arts practice and space, he's had art fellowships with Yaddo, McDowell, New City Arts Initiative, Gilead Compass Faith Coordinating Center. He is audiovisual art, has been featured at Second Street Gallery, Welcome Gallery, Bridge Projects, and the African American Museum here. All his work is about otherwise possibility. Dr. Kellie Jones is a chair of the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies and Hans Hofmann Professor of Modern Art in the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University. Her research interests include African American and African diaspora artists, Latinx and Latin American artists, and issues in contemporary art and museum theory. Dr. Jones, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences with an honorary doctorate from the Courtauld in London, has also received awards for her work from the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research, Harvard University, and Creative Capital Warhouse Foundation. In 2016, she was named a MacArthur Foundation Fellow. Dr. Jones's writings have appeared in a multitude of exhibition catalogs and journals. She is the author of 2 books published by Duke University Press, I Minded, Living and Writing Contemporary Art, and South of Pico, African American artist in Los Angeles in the 1960s and 70s. which received the Walter Lillian Lowenfels Criticism Award from the American Book Award in 2018 and was named as Best Book of the Decade in 2009 by Art News, Best Book of 2017 in the New York Times, and the Best Book of 2017 in Art Forum. Basically, if you haven't read it, you need to read it. Dr. Jones has also worked as a curator for over 3 decades and has numerous major national and international exhibitions to her credit. Her exhibition, Now Dig This, Art in Black Los Angeles, 1960 through 1980 at the Hammer Museum, was named one of the best exhibitions of 2011 and 2012 by Art Forum, and Best Thematic Show nationally by the International Association of Art Critics. She was co-curator of Witness, Art and Civil Rights in the 1960s, and which was also named one of the best exhibitions of 2014 by Art Forum. So thank you for bearing with me, and let's get started. Ashon, to the stage.
Hi, everybody. Face ID. Thankful to be here and to be a part of this conversation, and for the invitation from Erin Christovale, and for my co-panelist, Dr. Kellie Jones. It's always a joy to be able to share some work or some thinking or some ideas, and I'm very joyful today. Sorry, y'all. 112 Poplar Street was home to First Baptist Church in Elizabethtown. This small building was designed by John Y. Hill and built in 1834 for the then Severns Baptist Church congregation. Used as a hospital during the Civil War, the building changed hands when the neighborhood changed faces in 1897, with Black folks making the majority of the population by that time. Having gone through various renovations, it was the place that Bob Thompson would call a church home in his youth. President of the junior church department, he was allowed to let his oratory practice emerge in that space, because that's how Black church is at its most intense and formative, a space from which to practice things, to learn things, to grow, and to stretch. Stories of being encouraged to take leadership roles and to hone one's skills are repeated by all kinds of people. There were so many opportunities to practice things, Sunday school reports to the congregation, Easter and Christmas speeches and other special programs that all had designated times in which young people could present to the entire congregation and would be encouraged to do so. This, of course, is true for the music. Musicians could learn their chops while also messing up a lot, because the space could be a place of experimentation. But even if not practicing or playing an instrument in a church, the space could be a place where a musician, through repetitive inhabitation, could be a place from which the structure and aesthetics of Black church and Black life could be made manifest to them. Charles Mingus, for example, used various motifs from the aesthetic practice of the Sanctified Holiness Pentecostal Church his mother would visit in Los Angeles. It was not so much him learning to play the organ or the drums or the tambourine in the service, as much as he learned how to sense things and transform the things he sensed in those places into impressions for music. But what if one were a painter? Is there a way to transform that sense impression felt in the music, the beat, the rhythm, the pulse, into something like a visual register? Is there a form that Black church takes that perhaps Bob Thompson not only abided within, but reproduced and then also expanded. At the age of 12, there we go. At the age of 12, Bob Thompson delivered to the First Baptist congregation a speech titled God's Scales. The speech is it's the one on the right side. I'm like, what side is right? It's the one on the right. The speech is a short exhortation about justice, mercy, and the way he envisioned God acting in the world. But there's a painterly imagination at work in this speech, one that the space of the Black church allowed him, allowing him to offer words and encouraging him to do so in leadership allowed for his imagination to flower and bloom. I'm going to quote from this. He says, "One day as Jesus talked to a large crowd upon a Judean hillside, he showed them the largest pair of scales that has ever been seen, before or since, for in them he weighed everything in the world. Let me tell you about it. He must have hung the huge scales from the Milky Way, for there was nothing on earth high enough to hold them. On one side he began to put all the things within the sight of the crowd on the hillside. He took the olives from the slope nearby. He took the herd of sheep grazing in the meadow at the foot of the hill. He took all the armor of the Roman soldiers at Jerusalem and piled it into the scale. He reached across the Mediterranean Sea and took the libraries of Alexandria. He reached across the years and the oceans and took all the United States gold from the storehouse at Fort Knox. He took all the jewels from the Fifth Avenue stores of New York City. He took the bridge from the Golden Gate in San Francisco. All the ivory and all the forests of mahogany from the heart of Africa were heaped upon the mountain of wonderful things, and by he had everything valuable from every land and every age placed in the left-hand side of the balance. And the people stared in amazement and said to one another, 'There is nothing left to put into the other side.'" End quote. This is an audio-visual imagination at work. This is the taking of the sound of Black Baptist life, the sound of Black folks living, the sound and visual registers Black folks live and breathe and practice as the exorbitance of and against form. Because he is overwhelming the imagination in ways that he would come to use color and light in his visual work. The speech of the then 12-year-old Bob Thompson is a striving that finds resonance in the various practices of Black social life. Church is but one place in which this sociality was and in some ways continues to be practiced. Where else could you weekly go, and in some cases daily, to be together and sing and eat and learn and pray and lament and celebrate and dance? It was a possibility of recurrence, a space open for gathering at regular intervals that allowed flesh to become and be. And that is the import of the Black church. Spaces in which the practice of repetition was both rehearsal and staged performance. Spaces and moments in which each gathering was an experiment of form and content, the practice of possibility. But the repetition, has often been conflated with what the gathering does. And it has often been conflated with the idea that the church is the only or perhaps best iteration of an institution that could produce a sense of belonging, a sense of gathering that does not dispense with or demean or discard mystery, joy, uncertainty, and love. Artists tell us differently. After such a conflation, unfortunately, the idea that the doctrinal and theological orientation of particular churches and particular church communities then come to own the sense for and toward the mystery, the joy, the uncertainty, love, and the practice of gathering. Artists teach us differently. When we search for that sense of otherwise than the church, one can detect the ways repetition itself creates a foundation, and repetition itself created the foundation and carried the practice, and that it was not a particular doctrinal position and theological orientation. So it actually doesn't matter that he's going to a Black Baptist church that perhaps in 1945 and 1949 might have a different doctrinal understanding of God and Jesus and drinking and sin than the Pentecostal church that's around the corner. It actually doesn't matter when it's Black folks gathering. The various orientations around doctrine and the various practices of gathering are a gift. The sense-making repetitions that gathering allows is the ground that is also felt in juke joints, dance clubs, spades tournaments, and between two paintings. Eddie Glaude, in his book, A Short Introduction to African American Religion, says the following, quote, African American religion is a practice of freedom. The Black religious imagination is used in the service of opening up spaces closed down by white supremacy. African American religion is a sign of difference, and African American religion insists on an open-ended orientation. African American religion offers resources for African Americans to imagine themselves beyond the constraints of now, end quote. Any doctrine or theological proposition or any tradition or structure of belief that is sustained in African America or Black religious practice that is not in the service of the flourishing of all Black life, that is not about the practice of freedom, not difference and open-ended, that is antithetical to the tradition, then it is antithetical to the tradition from which it emerges. Such open-endedness necessitates thinking about and with and through the more of Black social life, the exorbitance, the force against enclosure, capture, and form. To be in the posture and practice of open-endedness is to with joy and delight tarry for the more to emerge, or what I call otherwise possibility. This means that alternatives to what is considered to be normal already exist. Alternatives are in the thing itself, that you can always think the thing otherwise than itself. And this is what I discover in Bob Thompson's paintings. I have a friend who says that Black music since 1900 hasn't just changed the world in terms of the kinds of musical traditions it has allowed to grow and to flourish. Ragtime, the blues, jazz, spirituals, gospel, R&B, soul, funk, disco, rock and roll, electronic, house, go-go, and hip-hop. I'm leaving out a lot. But Black music does so in a kind of intense and intensely meditative way. It's as if there were a valve released, and what came gushing and rushing out was the creative possibility always already there, the otherwise possibility internal to Black social life. And taking things as materials with which to experiment and create something new, something otherwise than the original, is something that Black folks have been doing for such a long time. Because it's a Black Baptist congregation in Kentucky in the 1930s, 1940s, and the 1950s, I imagine service in which Bob Thompson is sitting as a young person, beginning with devotion, likely starting with a song, A Charge to Keep I Have, in which the song leader calls out the hymn to the congregation saying, I love the Lord, he heard my cry. And the congregation responds intensely and intentionally, and also with hesitance, I love the Lord, he heard my cry. If you've heard it before, you know what I mean. This is call and response. This is antiphony. But with each congregant's response to the call is intensity as well, is saturation, is movement toward the limit of the song's lyrics, movement toward the overwhelming of the words, meaning unable to be contained or captured by the lyrical content. And this is the kind of relation between leader and congregation is accretional. It's about building layers of tone and sound and color and texture and intensity to release for some otherwise movement of spirit to occur. Bob Thompson created more than 1,000 pieces in his too short life, in his too short 10-year period of making things. This is another kind of practice of intensity similar to the development of Black music, but in an even more concentrated way. This is another kind of practice of intensity that is meditative, a spiritual condition as conviction. It's as if he were after something that the repetitious practice of brushstrokes on canvas and wood and other surfaces was allowing him to consider and feel and think through. And it's both about and also beyond anything that might be framed in the painting itself. The color overwhelms like a lined out hymn, like a choral reply, like a congregation's arrhythmic density of sound and light and color and texture in voice and flesh, making such singing and sounding out apparent. Consider, for example, these two pictures, these two paintings. Thompson's The Carriage from 1965, which is his comment on Nicolas Poussin's Autumn Night, or The Grapes Brought from the Promised Land, created about 300 years prior to Thompson's. It's correct from critics to interrogate the idea that he was simply influenced by and reproducing the great works of others. Diana Tweet says, quote, "He asserts his right to an imaginary space of belonging, one that may be conditionally open or available to others, but is ultimately private. It is a remit that undercuts the default premise of modernism," end quote. And he undercuts this premise or the assumption of modernism's universality. And this because Thompson was aware of form. Quote, "I'm interested in the relationships of the figure and the landscape, mass against movement. To me, presenting the forms are the most important thing, the way they work against one another with regard to space. I try to bring movement into the painting with color, drawing, and the composition as a whole," end quote. Content is not meaningless for him, it's not inconsequential, but it is not the bigger part. What his abstract forms allow for is the space between, and the space between is the antiphonal movement of a caller and a congregational reply. That is where the life is made and happens, and that is where the life between is sustained. That working against is a striving for an accretional yes, a building of light and color and shade and texture in order to think about what precedes and what remains, but also how to disrupt linear time as always moving forward and progressive. And also, Thompson says, quote, I cannot find a place nor category in which to put my paintings, nor a name to call them, provoked by a feeling of disdain for the gallery-going public's notion of what a painting should be," end quote. Perhaps we might just call it a black painting then. And if a disdain for the normative gallery-going public, what he is attempting in his work is a performative utterance that will repel or at least have the audience question or have them interrogate what they think they expect of painting in the first place. Because that audience attempts to devour and to consume according to the whims of their political and economic appetites, their conspicuous consumption, their hope for black cool. He attempts a painting practice that overwhelms the frame and of the viewer's expectations of what painting is and what it should be. He wants his work, in other words, to speak and to speak back, to sound and to sound out, to call and to solicit response, even if that response is the repelling of a particular kind of relation to sensual experience that reduces painting to the visual. It is the repetition of the phrase, "I love the Lord, he heard my cry," that lets one sense the difference between what the person who called it sounds like and what emerges in reply through the congregation. Such that Thompson's work tries to create a space in which to linger in the presence of various experiences. He overwhelms the structure with color and is interested in how the viewers will reply. And the viewer's experiences of the pieces have to pause and rest and shift their temporal meter in ways like the song, "I love the Lord, he heard my cry," like a congregation together but separately in that togetherness, separately in their sociality, such that each one of us is hailed, each one of us is called upon, and the social reply and response is that of our difference, our varied breaths and excitements and joys and curiosities of what his painting does too. Even if you sang the song in the morning church service, you might and often would sing that same song in the afternoon church service, because each gathering is an occasion for possibility of feeling and feeling something, sensing something, being changed, unalterably altered, and to try to take that energy, to try to take that impressionistic feel, to try to take form and to make it register in ways that are visual but not reducible to the visual, is what Bob Thompson gifted to us and the world. Thank you.
In a 1965 interview, when asked about his work, Bob Thompson said, "I am trying to show what's happening, what's going on in my own private way." While Thompson was speaking to the 1960s, a decade marked by radical change in America, his works also housed his innermost struggles and secrets, masked as recurring figures that haunted the work. For example, in 1963 work on canvas, Spinning, Spinning, Turning, Directing, Thompson renders a scene rife with chaos, flanked by an isolated figure in the foreground who seems to be both directing the theatrics of havoc while at the same time totally caught off guard by its out-of-control nature. Seemingly spun out, the painting features several figures that recur throughout his work, such as the elderly shawled woman, the flying high bird, and the flailing pale nude. There is also a prominent cave-like opening in the background, teasing a taste of paradise just beyond the unstable scene. Thompson, who adapted the archway from Francisco Goya's work, implements it as a way to signal a portal and distinction between light and dark, heaven and hell, peril and paradise. In curator Gilbert Coker's 1985 essay, Honeysuckle Rose to Scrapple from the Apple, she notes that often in Goya's work there is an arch which dominates everything, a hoboglobin, a shadow which suggests a bridge or a porch. More often, it is a hidden place. Here, Thompson, like Goya, creates non-specific space, but reworks the arch of the hoboglobin to suggest an underground or cave-like environment. This work brings forth many questions. Is Thompson the figure in the center, giving the viewer an insight into his personal proscenium? And more importantly, has he lost all control? Born in Louisville, Kentucky in 1937 to Cecil and Bessie Thompson, Bob was the youngest of three. His father owned the only black dry cleaning service in the area, and his mother was a school teacher. At age 13, and on the evening of November 30th, 1950, Bob's father passed away in a tragic car accident when his delivery truck was forced off the road and ultimately overturned. In an interview, Bob's sister Phyllis noted that Thompson's whole world fell apart, and that when his father's blood-stained clothes were returned from the mortuary, he took the box in silence and retreated to his room. He also suffered several physical ailments after his father's death, including a brief loss of hearing. Phyllis also noted that his mother, quote, turned increasingly to her son, doting on him and spoiling him to an extent that he would eventually find stifling. After deep concern for his well-being and mental state, his mother eventually sent him to live with his eldest sister, Cecile, and her husband, Robert Holmes, in Boston, who introduced him to the worlds of art and jazz. In an obituary written by his mother shortly after his death in 1966, she memorialized him by saying, quote, Bob was born June 26, 1937 in Louisville, Kentucky. He weighed 8 pounds and was named after his grandmother and grandfather, Robbie Shante and Joe Lewis, his full name, Robert Louis Thompson. He started walking when he was 9 months old, and by the time he was 3, he could sing nursery rhymes and was going to school with his mother, who was a school teacher at the time. He loved to visit Mr. and Miss Murray, who lived on a nearby farm. He loved the animals and enjoyed milking the cows and learned to ride when he was 4. He especially liked the horses. He spent a good part of his younger years in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, played basketball in the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grades in Elizabethtown. He went to high school in Louisville at Central High, where he won his varsity letter in 1954. He also played golf and won a trophy for that. He loved all kinds of sports. His mother and father ran a country club in Elizabethtown, where he learned to play golf when he was 8. One night, when the singer with the band was out sick, Bob got up on one of the tables and sang all of her songs. He made enough in tips to buy 2 war bonds. He was always old for his age. He used to dance the jitterbug with his sisters and their friends when his father took him up to Fisk to visit them. They were 10 and 12 years older. His mother bought him a hot rod when he was 15, and he wrote for a newspaper called the Hot Rod Associates. His father died when he was 13, and he had to be the man of the house and take his mother to dances, banquets, etc., which he loved. Thompson's teenage years give insight into the educational pathways and goals that his family, now stewarded by 3 maternal figures, including his mother and 2 sisters, had idealized for him. He was considered a golden boy, receiving awards such as a certificate for regular attendance and faithful work at Vacation Bible School at First Baptist Church in Elizabethtown, and a varsity letter for 2 years on Central High's football team in Louisville. He would give speeches in church on the value of one's soul in connection to Jesus' love, and in 1954 he gave a speech on the importance of being a good citizen, stating, quote, "There is citizenship in the church, which is accomplished only by the people within themselves and within their faith in God. Then there is the school, which helps to understand or to have religious, cultural, and racial understanding about citizenship. Then the school helps us to become better, materialized adults." At the same time, Thompson developed a newfound interest in hot rods, building one at the age of 15. While the sport of racing was considered dangerous, his mother saw his affinity for the pastime and supported it. It's not lost on me that Thompson picks up a desire for speed racing automobiles shortly after his father passes away from a car accident. And I think this was one of the many subconscious ways in which he could feel close to a beloved paternal figure that was now absent. I also think this need for speed and the chase of the thrill was a way for Thompson to escape the methodical and traditional lifestyle that was laid out for him without his consideration. The Chase, made in 1958, is a self-portrait of Thompson chasing a seagull on the gloomy shores of Provincetown, Massachusetts. After dropping out of medical school after 1 year at Boston University to the dismay of his family, followed by dropping out of art school at the University of Louisville a year later, Thompson headed for the Bohemian Artist Enclave of Provincetown in the summer of 1958 and enrolled in the Seong Moy School of Painting and Graphic Arts. Thompson rented a cabin for one of the few Black people who lived in town, an older blind man named Nathan, and quickly formed newfound friendships with fellow artists such as Red Grooms and Emilio Cruz. He also learned of artists such as John Mueller, a German immigrant who had passed away a year prior and whose work became a major influence due to his figurative style at a time when abstract expressionism was in vogue. Thompson exhibited several works in the Provincetown Arts Festival that year, in which 13 of those works were acquired by Walter Chrysler, who became a staunch collector and benefactor. While somber and pallid, The Chase depicts the capture of an unexpected animal in flight, as Thompson grips tightly, capturing the winged creature. The title and image work together to suggest the thrilling satisfaction of a moment of victory after a prolonged pursuit. One of the earliest uses of bird imagery in his work, Thompson would later note that the birds represent freedom, recalling a dream in which a flock, quote, "swept up everything, including me." In many ways, this painting represents a newfound sense of liberation of a young artist finding his way in the world as an individual, stepping away from the expectations of his Black middle-class upbringing and into the avant-garde and experimental counterculture of the 1960s. It marks a moment of reinvention of his personal pursuits and the modes in which he decides to wield his Blackness. Around this time, in a letter to his mother, Thompson notes that he is, quote, a man who changes constantly, which means progression in my book, and as long as one progresses, there is no stopping. This quote clearly signals his newfound sense of man and selfhood. A year later, Thompson decides to move to New York and lands in the belly of the Lower East Side. He befriends people like Ornette Coleman, Allen Ginsberg, and even Nina Simone, marking a final departure from his wholesome origins as he falls deeper into an epicenter of artistic innovation. While the Lower East Side was considered a hotbed of figures who changed the trajectory of American culture, this space was also deeply fueled by drugs, the onset of the sexual revolution, and the celebration of alternative lifestyles. Thompson loved jazz, and his friend, saxophonist Steve Lacy, even suggested that Thompson was, quote, jazz himself, explaining that the way he painted was like jazz, taking liberties with colors. Thompson, like many young Black men at the time who were embracing the avant-garde, adored Charlie Parker. Parker, affectionately known as Bird, was a saxophonist and jazz great who redefined the genre with the introduction of bebop. Thompson loved Parker's music from an early age, and apparently he would smoke cigarettes and listen to his records with his summer camp youth counselors. When Thompson landed in New York, he quickly fell in with several notable jazz musicians of the time, frequenting clubs like the Five Spot Cafe and Slug's Saloon. For Thompson and his musical peers, Parker was a patron saint of jazz and the embodiment of cool. Parker was also a noted heroin addict, suffering from addiction until his death, brought on by an introduction of morphine at the age of 16 when he was injured in a car accident. Here we see another introduction of the Bird figure with the play on words in the title, Charlie Parker, Waiting in the Wings. Parker, who is most likely the silhouetted figure, seems shocked at the figures that are mounting two women. Again, there are so many questions at play. Is this an act of sex or violence or both? Is this consensual? Who are these dark silhouetted figures and the pale nude women they are engaged with? In his own private way, I believe that this piece is as much a declaration of sexual intentions as it is a confessional to Thompson's newfound interest, drugs and women. Not only was the Bird figure a symbol of liberation, but represented a group of young Black men who were at the cutting edge of cool, like their idol, and whose sexual desires in white women caused scandals back home. On a panel dedicated to Thompson in 1986, artist Emilio Cruz reflects on the summer that they met in Provincetown, stating that Thompson was not into heavy drugs at the time, but that he had claimed to be previously initiated into heroin use by a prominent musician who had visited Louisville while on tour. Thompson's drug use would, like Parker, eventually contribute to his untimely death at the age of 28. In Fearful Insider, we see a dark silhouetted figure caught in the middle of a partition and a Rothko painting. We can assume that the figure is Thompson, seemingly caught between the trend at the time that was abstraction and his decision to pursue figuration. While this seems to be the canonical conversation at hand, there also seems to be a subtext to the work in regards to Thompson's Blackness. The title gives us insight into his hesitations and fears of the time, and scholar Bridget Cook suggests that, quote, Fearful Insider depicts reasonable anxieties about being a young Black artist entering the art world, end quote. This silhouetted figure becomes a recurring presence throughout his work, suggesting the looming yet isolated presence of Thompson and the lack of belonging he couldn't quite escape. In Stairway to the Stars, we witness a host of Thompson's friends as they descend the stairs of an American Airlines jet into his vibrant paradise. The many people who are depicted, like Allen Ginsberg, Charlie Hayden, and Red Grooms, seem to relish in jovial conversation and collectivity as their vibrant fleshy tones and the hues that surround them appear to be inviting and alive. However, the shadowy figure appears again, this time hatted, facing the group and cut off on the canvas. Curator and director Thelma Golden suggests that this is a stand-in for Thompson, noting that the hatted man is a, quote, apparition that appears and reappears throughout Thompson's career. The figure represents Thompson himself, not a self-portrait, but a coded mark of his presence in and on the periphery of his pictures, end quote. I'd also like to suggest that this figure houses his feelings of isolation and deep estrangement from those around him, alluding to a deep, dark depression inside that he just couldn't shake. The following works speak to Thompson's complicated relationship to the women in his life. Thompson married his wife, Carol Plinda, in 1960 in Provincetown after meeting her at Cedar Bar, a local dive that him and his friends frequented. Carol, a white woman, made clothing, and friends noted that she hosted and cooked constantly, and that Thompson always wanted her in the studio with him. In this untitled work, we clearly see Bob and Carol rising above three female figures as their identities are noted in their wings that label them as B and C. They seem unfazed by the scene below them as an older, shawled woman looks up in concern and prayer. Thompson and Carol spent time in Europe where he studied the old masters and moved to the island of Ibiza for a brief stint in 1962. It was there that Thompson fully immersed himself in the fables and fury of Francisco Goya's work. In Goya's work, the shawled women who represented what considered to be a peasant class in the 18th century Spain embodied a conservatism and dedication to tradition. Here, we see that Thompson has implemented this figure as a way to invoke his mother. Over the years, Thompson had an ongoing correspondence with his mother and sisters and wrote letters to them elaborating on his newfound life and their impossible expectations. In a letter to his mother on the way to Mexico, he notes, "I'm on my way to Mexico, we'll detail later. Am happy moving to nowhere up on an idea satisfied beyond control. I'm going somewhere. I realize, Mother, that you have somewhat of a problem believing in me, but I ask of you to bear and not so much understand, but be with me. I can never fail if you are with me." In this work, the shawled figure clearly represents his mother's sentiments regarding his decisions to live freely and marry someone he chooses. Her conservatism and religious beliefs no longer concern him. The other two figures at the bottom of the work seem to represent his two older sisters, Cecile and Phyllis, who play with a small, Christ-like figure who is Thompson. In a 1960 letter to Cecile, he writes, quote, "I am sorry, Cecile, that I have misled myself and you pertaining to the almost forgotten thing to me now, academic education. Sorry because of not realizing sooner that it is impossible for me to live with such security as a degree or job or position." In Descent from the Cross, we see yet another entanglement of the women in his life through his version of the Flemish work originally created in 1435 by Roger van der Weyden. This work marks Jesus' removal from the cross, but in Thompson's work, the small Christ-like figure surrounded by three women who seemed to be his wife in the center, his mother to the left, and a representation of his sisters to the right. Both of these works clearly depict Thompson's ongoing battle for freedom and his connection to his family. I think there are many questions in both of these works, and I think one of the largest questions that stand out for me is, how do these three Black women who have reared this young Black man now fit into his lifestyle? And finally, I wanted to end on this self-portrait in the studio, which was done in 1966 in one of his studios in New York. I think it's a really beautiful painting that encompasses the two great loves of his life, music and art. As you can see, there's a conga drum there, which he always had in his studio. But at the same time, you can see that there's a clear heaviness over Thompson's body. And I'll end with that. Thank you.
Hello, Los Angeles. How are you? Always good to be back in LA. I was speaking yesterday about Huey Lee Smith, and I was telling people LA is my happy place, and they were like, what? It's like, yeah, man, it's LA. What's not to like? Hope everybody's doing well. Good to be here. And good to be back on this stage where I've been numerous times, so it's always good to be back. Okay. Actually, all right. I'm going to try to skip over some of the things that my lovely colleagues have talked about, but we'll see. By 1950, the avant-garde artists in New York City, popularly called the New York School, attracted the kind of attention previously only given to artists in European cities, most recently Paris. But while this new type of abstraction was emanating from the US, part of its development was owed to European experiments. In 1940, artist immigrants from Europe began coming to the US in great numbers to escape World War II and bringing a culture of abstract experimentation and new developments in surrealism. And that will come up a little bit for us later, these ideas about the kind of surreal and how we can think about it in terms of what Bob Thompson was up to. By the mid-1940s, the US had absorbed these ideas, incorporating the new in surrealism, reacquainting themselves with earlier experiments in abstraction, and by the late 40s, we see the development of the first major US contribution to modernist art language, to the history of Western art, and that is abstract expressionism. And you can see that in people such as Jackson Pollock and also Norman Lewis here. We can think about the bridging of figuration and abstraction in the work of African American artists more clearly in the work of somebody like Richard Hunt, sculptor Richard Hunt, and you can see some of his works on the screen. He was also a contemporary of Thompson's, born in Chicago in 1935. And we can see this expressionistic sculpture bridging the gap between the totally non-objective work and another stream of figurative expressionism that was concurrent with later abstract expressionism. And you can see early on, he's using found metals, creating surrealist-inspired compositions that suggest the vegetal, insect, animal, and human as references, as well as organic crossovers in between. So if you see, you look at Ariadne here at the bottom, it kind of more kind of figurative, but still we would see it kind of perhaps in our time more as a cyborg. But if you go to the later pieces, which are concurrent with Bob Thompson's work, you can see how they just kind of explode in their kind of hybridity, in their kind of lack of categorization that we can also ascribe to somebody like Bob Thompson. And I think for many years in teaching, you go to, especially traditional ways of teaching American art, abstract expressionism, and the figure kind of gets thrown out. Nobody really talks about the figure until Pop, several years later. But it was always kind of a conundrum for art historians to think that Black artists continued, there was still something they wanted to do with the figure. And certainly Bob Thompson gives us that, as well as somebody like Hunt. Bob Thompson practiced figurative as opposed to abstract expressionism. And, again, had been seen kind of peripheral for a number of years because of this, the triumph of American painting, as Irving Sandler called it. This is the time when the U.S., enters into the canon, and they like to think that they've never lost their dominance. So, again, seeing the figure in this time earlier as kind of retardataire, passé, but in fact, artists such as de Kooning, who we see here on the right, had always, for the most part, been working with the figure, and Pollock, over time, had used it with certain success. So it's not like, it had totally gone away for canonical, AKA white artists at all. And there's others, there's a whole other series that I could talk about, not expressionism, but others, Jack Levine, for instance, that held on to these things. So we heard a little bit about the biography. I won't go into that so much, but that he, again, as Erin just told us, spent the summer of 1958 in Provincetown, and eventually, and around a group of people who were also using the figure, Grooms, Red Grooms, Emilio Cruz, others, Lester Johnson. But there was a different kind of narrative that we pick up on in Bob Thompson's work. He moves to New York in 1959 and hangs out with the, quote, downtown scene. And those are the people who he had met in Provincetown. And I want to think about here the kind of idea of uptown and downtown New York at that time. Black artists traditionally were uptown in Harlem, right? And we can, I'm gonna paraphrase from Jacob Lawrence that, if you were a black person going downtown during certain years, you better put on a janitor's uniform, so you wouldn't stick out. So there was an uptown art world for black people and a downtown art world for white people. And this is the moment when you start seeing that begin to break down with people like Thompson. And also, one of the things that I was so excited about in the show, so beautiful, you all need to see it, I'm gonna leave some time for that or come back. Or maybe you've already seen it before the talk. But the catalog of the show, some of the archival information showing, and I always love to see, the exhibition announcements, showing the range of who is showing in that East Village context, right? And I think now when I'm working with students who are writing about 60s and 70s East Village, and they talk about all the destruction of the landscape and all that. I was like, oh, wait a minute. People were there making art. So something is not destroying, something is not bringing down. But just showing people like, we're beginning to hear about over and over again now, Jack Whitten, Joe Overstreet, Robert De Niro's father, Bob De Niro, Wolf Kahn, Danny Johnson, Larry Rivers. So it's a real mixed group of people that are participating in this scene, right? And he also operated in, these kind of spaces with music, right? And the kind of vanguard of music, literature, as well as art. And this scene at this moment, it was more diverse, these kind of black and white worlds coming together in a way that was unprecedented previously, especially for the inclusion of African American artists. We also want to think about, as we think about this kind of music, this is one of my favorite paintings. Please don't look, this is not the best slide. The painting is upstairs. You've got to see it. The Garden of Music, love it. And, kind of detailing perhaps some of his friends from this world. John Coltrane, Ed Blackwell, Sonny Rollins, Ornette Coleman, Don Cherry, Charlie Hayden. And some writers have also talked about the kind of seeing surrealism and trying to map a kind of black surrealism. Franklin Rosemont and Robin D.G. Kelly have talked about how we can see that idea in these early 60s groupings. And that's in their book, Black, Brown, and Beige, Surrealist Writings from Africa and the Diaspora. And just interesting to think about the kind of the freedom of that, and also seeing writers in that as well. One of the things that stood out to me in thinking about how that might relate to Thompson's work, and seeing how this kind of thread of surrealism comes throughout the 20th century, maybe landing in this early 60s moment in the US. They write, "Surrealism does not signify unreality, anti-reality, the nonsensical, or the absurd. On the contrary, surrealism and open realism signifies more reality and expanded awareness of reality, including aspects and elements of the real that are ordinarily overlooked, dismissed, excluded, hidden, shunned, suppressed, ignored, forgotten, or otherwise neglected." And that otherwise, thinking about Ashon's work with that otherwise idea. There's also another way to think about the kind of Bob Thompson riffing on these quote unquote old masters, European artists, where he's lifting portions, entire compositions of old master paintings and reinterprets them. It's part of an accepted technique in Western art. And you want to think about people like African-American artist Henry O. Tanner, Portrait of the Artist's Mother, one of the few that he actually makes of Black people, relying instead on biblical themes. And I think, love to see Ashon, I'm giving him assignments, that's wrong. But write about Tanner, because the majority of his work are these biblical themes, right? Not identifiable Black people, right? But really riffing on Whistler's arrangement in Gray and Black, Portrait of the Artist's Mother as well, from 20 years earlier, 25 years earlier. And artists doing this as a means of instruction, but also a register of ambition, right? You did that, I'm gonna do this. Look at mine, So there is this tradition of redoing, rethinking, learning, and surpassing your elders in that. For Thompson, it was also an action like jazz improvisation on standard tunes, taking liberties with colors, the way jazz musicians were taking liberties with instruments and notes. And his travels in Europe in the early 60s reinforce that technique. Compositions are drawn from old master sources, reorchestrated using high-key color and smooth contours. And you can see that here at another painting that's upstairs. And we want to think about, at least one way to think about Thompson also is uniting his painting style with the musical sensibility of jazz, driving rhythms, startling variations or hallucinations, and emotional intensity, and connecting these ideas with European painting. And, you know, to some degree, and maybe really thinking about the compositions, European compositions, I want to go back to that. In some ways, Thompson's use of the old masters of Western art for inspiration and compositional structure in some ways might not have been seen as in step with Black consciousness of the 1960s. However, we want to think about, as some of the other authors in the wonderful catalog, Adrian Childs, for instance, thinking about the chromatic freedom and imagination, variation versus citation, and using these this format of painting to how to aptly represent the racial trauma and triumphs of the American Civil Rights Movement through surrealism, through hallucination, through another otherwise reality, right? And seeing perhaps somebody like Romare Bearden and Colescott as commentary, while Thompson, in Thompson, the chroma diffuses the potent signifier of the Black body. We also want to think about how, you know, his work differs from kind of social realism in this way. If we're talking about certain ideas of trauma to the Black body, you can see here Jacob Lawrence labeled a social realist in some degree, but his migration series from the 40s, right? And even there, you're not seeing the destroyed body. You're seeing somebody mourning, and then this kind of noose-like thing. We also want to think about somebody like Huey Lee Smith, who I was talking about yesterday, in terms of this kind of how, this kind of melancholic space, how this idea of surrealism can come through as well, to think about violence through another lens, right? As somebody like Bridget Cooks talks about, these themes of sex, violence, persecution resonated in mythical and earlier paintings. She talks about very powerfully lynching as a theme in some of the early paintings, not seen upstairs, but a painting called The Execution from 1961 would fit in with that. But, you know, we want to think about other ways people have tried to address these kind of ideas. And Lowry Sims talking about, you know, these kind of chroma as well, and comparing them to Colescott, Robert Colescott, who also took on, you know, the historical as well. Let's go here, actually. And Colescott, she quotes Colescott on Thompson, "I think he wanted us to feel, I feel. I think he wanted us to laugh, I laugh. I think he saw us as orgasmic." And that brings in the kind of sexual aspect. I'm going to skip over this next part, except to say that he was one of the earliest art stars. You know, you have Jacob Lawrence, maybe Charles White, but Bob Thompson really kind of, quote unquote, crossed over at a young age, and I always in that way compare him to Jean-Michel Basquiat in terms of this meteoric rise and then disappearance, at least in body, although the art lives on. And thank you for the curator, Diana Tweet, for bringing this wonderful show to us. Really want to thank you for that. And your discussion of the Poussanian space and how it relates to the figure-ground relationship. Ashon already showed this, so I'll go through it very quickly. But how Poussin was important at this moment because it was his 300th birthday, but also, as Diana talks about, the antithetical, Poussin represented the antithetical pole of Enlightenment aesthetics, right? And Poussin was this kind of dominant late interlocutor in some ways with Thompson, and you can see it in the carriage where she points out the kind of how this becomes a body also kind of hanging in the middle versus Poussin's, giant grapes there. But how this kind of figure-ground relationship that he was always dealing with brings out some other elements in it. It was interesting to me because I had been talking about Poussin in my work with Micheline Thomas in her latest book I did with Roxane Gay, and thinking about this particular image, Landscape with Women Washing Her Feet from 1650, as it related to Bearden in a green shade. And it's a little bit difficult to see, but you can, wondering if this is, anyway, the figure kind of bent over, it's hard to see in Bearden, on the, all the way on the right, then gets, he's taking it from there and then gets into Micheline here with his kind of animal print figure. You can see the close list with Micheline, but Micheline really goes through Bearden to get to Poussin in many ways, right? Because she was really interested in Bearden. But just to think about this kind of the antithetical idea of what Poussin is offering for artists and Black artists in this period is interesting. And how, somebody even later, Bearden's picking it up, Micheline Thomas after that. So just what that is that he offers to Black artists. So I'm just gonna end with a little bit of this painting, which is part of why I think Erin wanted me to come here to speak, so I'm not gonna let you all down. I've already written about it, my other book, I Minded, but I'm just gonna read from that because I've already said it very well. I don't wanna paraphrase myself and mess it up. But in the introduction to that book, which is a collection of essays over 25 years in conversation with my family, Amiri Baraka, Kellie Jones, who you see there, my sister Lisa Jones, who you kind of see, and you'll hear about it in a minute. But it's also a conversation with Barack Obama's first book, and how he is looking for his father, right? And it just presented so much for me to riff on at the time that I was writing my book, that his kind of finding these images of his father that he hadn't known about in Kenya, in his sister's home, made him think about what an archive is and how you can find your family anywhere. Sometime in the early 1960s, and this is me quoting me, Joseph Hirshhorn purchased the canvas Leroy Jones and his family. I knew it as Leroy Jones and Family from 1964. And there are a number of other paintings up there that are from that same, they're all from 64 that Hirshhorn, that shopping trip he did. The painting was unfinished. My mother and father are painted in, my sister and I are only outlines sketched out in chalk, and you can see the kind of white chalk lines there. Thompson painted over another work, and a single gnome-like figure shows through, in some ways a substitute for us children. And people have said, like, isn't that you? I'm like, oh no, baby. I was cuter than that, I'm sorry. Standing before this painting, as I have on numerous occasions, I am confronted perhaps with Some of the same feelings that Obama acknowledges opening the Kenyan photo album: loss, craving the happy, holistic notions of the nuclear family, wishing away the stigma of America's problematic history and inability to accept or acknowledge its own life of multicultural, where to have been mixed is to have been party to a great civilizational betrayal. Seeing in miscegenation a word humpbacked, ugly, pretending a monstrous outcome. A notion perhaps even inscribed in this very painting, in the place where beautiful babies are replaced by a strange, deformed creature. But then there is life, my own memories of a life lived in worlds different but exciting, full of things to learn, understand, enjoy, dance and listen to, see and live for. Life as fun, but life as mission, to tell it, to make people see, know, and accept all of it at whatever cost. A responsibility to the past, but also to the present and to the future, to write oneself back into history as a continual action, as a responsibility not just to oneself, but also to community, and in doing so, making claims to a notion of community, national and outer national, one where we choose the better parts of our histories and ourselves to live a conviviality that is spontaneous and organic, an intermixture that is at once banal and subversive in its ordinariness, to contribute to, in Paul Gilroy's words, contemporary cosmopolitics in the service of a planetary humanism and global multiculture, openness, and undifferentiated love, end quote. In the lower right-hand corner of Bob Thompson's Leroy Jones and Family, ghostly chalk letters hover over the unfinished portion of the painting. Ever more faded, a blocky signature emerges. Kellie, I signed, and in doing so, claimed what was partial and provisional, emerged where I was never supposed to, declared this space and my liminality not as a failure, but as a site of layering, multiplicity, and possibility, a space even utopic. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. That was fun. I think there's so much to talk about. I think, from his sort of personal background to thinking about canonically where his paintings lie. And I think, Ashon, you did this beautiful marriage of, thinking about the musicality of the Black church and how those rhythms may have inspired his work. I guess, where do I start with that? I guess I want to maybe think about, and I'll start with you, Ashon, like your introduction to his work, and particularly why you decided to focus on that painting.
I decided to focus on that painting because I think it was a crystallization of the kind of I was thinking a lot about, I've been sort of writing about African American vernacular English for a long time now, Ebonics, and how it really is about the exhausting of words, and how it's about taking a word but also like playing with the word and sort of allowing the letters to not actually capture the thing of it's not the thing, it's like it points to the thing. And in that way it's like a philosophical condition that Blackness is sort of constantly sort of practicing. And I feel like when I encountered the work and when I sort of began to really think about Thompson's work And when I began to read about his history and his childhood, and I'm reading this speech too, it really just resonated with me because I feel like it was the demonstration of the call and the response in terms of in a kind of technical way, the response to um, the piece, Poisson's piece. Is that how I pronounce it, y'all? My French is bad. Poussin. See? Poisson? I don't know. That's fish. That's fish. I didn't. Sorry. Sorry. I'm just bad. Um, but it is I mean, there's like the technical relationship between this is the piece that was sort of sent out and this is the response to that piece. But also, it felt very much like there is, in the way that he talks about form being the thing that he's trying to think through, it also felt to me like not the lack of content, but a kind of piece that is waiting for a kind of social relation, a kind of when someone sings "I love the Lord, He heard my cry," it is with the intention that there is a community, a body that will respond to it, and that will fill it with the variousness of their lives. And it doesn't have to be like one way to do it. That's why it's improvisational. Um, it's arrhythmic. And so there's this way that I felt that there was something in this piece that kind of allowed me to really sort of think about it in order to sit with it and really to think about the musicality of the color and to think about the texture of a kind of sound that I think is also apparent. And it really, it spoke to, I mean, it spoke to me in ways that were really, really moving. And yeah, so I think that's for me why it was the thing that sort of most called out to me. And, you know, I am have been getting a crash course in like black art in like the last 10 years and really just being introduced to so many different kinds of people, including Bob Thompson, and realizing that the thing that I thought was art as a young person was Bob Ross. I watched The Joy of Painting probably every day as a kid when I came home from school. It was on PBS, and I loved it. And it incited my imagination for wanting to be. I painted these things as painted mountains that I'd never been to. Um, but like discovering like this long tradition of black art that I literally did not know existed was really, really important to me. And you know, there's so much. So there was this woman. This last thing I'm gonna say. It's too long. But my father is a pastor of a Pentecostal church in New Jersey. And my mother is a preacher as well. And every year, we Pentecostal. There was an Usher's anniversary at different churches, and so my father would preach at these different churches. Sometimes the ushers at the church would say, "Can you come preach?" There was a woman who went to one of the churches in Morristown, New Jersey, who would go to the different ones because she was an usher. So she went to all the services, and any preacher who delivered a sermon, she would draw the sermon. She would do an illustration of it. And they were just with like blue, with big pens. And I keep trying to find them. I don't think they threw them away, but there's no. Where is it? Oh, I don't know. But like Sister Calistine, she just drew, and it fascinated me. But it was something that I never really thought that deeply about until much later. Like, no, like this is a person who's actually engaging in this kind of artistic imagination. She's literally she's transcribing the sermon through a sort of different register for people to, and she just gives it to the to whoever delivered the sermon. So she never keeps them. It's always for them. And seeing his work and seeing her work, it allows me to think about sort of the variousness of art practices that are both in relation to different kinds of formalist aesthetics, but also that diverge from them, that think with them, that explode them. And so being introduced to him and being introduced to so many it's been really generative for my own thinking and for my own sort of imaginative, sort of what I can imagine is possible too. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think to speak on this person who is creating these scenes of these church sermons, it makes me think of actually what doesn't get shown that much is, Thompson would go to these jazz clubs and he would sketch portraits of the players in motion. And even with these simple sketches that were sometimes just like blue ballpoint pen, you could still like kind of jump into the scene and feel the energy and the music and the shifts in that genre as it was going from bebop to free jazz and those were around. And it just makes me think of the sort of larger scene of the Lower East Side. And I think, Kellie, what you distinguished was really important, kind of this uptown, downtown distinction. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more on, I think, just that particular time frame in which Thompson landed in New York, because I feel like, first off, it's the 60s, so there's so much happening. There's, the beginnings of the civil rights movement, there's the sexual revolution, there's the beatnik generation. There are all these things that are kind of swirling around Thompson as he enters that space. And I feel like, obviously your parents were a part of that scene and wrote about it so much. I was curious if you can just give us a little more insight to that moment.
Well,
Please.
I was a baby.
Yeah.
But no, they've written about it, thankfully. But I think, what I had said, seeing now people write about this, particularly with art and certain types of art, and that it's always described as this kind of dystopic space. But I think what they fail, and I think this is art history's kind of silos. It's like they fail to, it's really a dropping out of the figure. Because when you think about all these people, like Larry Rivers and Bob Thompson and Emilio Cruz, and even Jack Whitten early on, what they have in common is kind of this figurative expressionist. And so art history, canonical art history, will leave that out because you don't have time, so you're going to jump from abstract expressionism to pop. And that leaves out this kind of messy thing, a kind of, diversity and interracial thing. Sometimes it gets talked about with Fluxus, but that comes later with Yoko Ono and people who are involved with that, Ben Patterson, and a lot of Asian artists and who are coming from Asia and being part of that. And equally as important, but I think it gets left out. And that's really what you're seeing with that, is that this is why I'm so glad for this show, and particularly seeing those flyers, which actually always tell the story, right? Because you see just the names of the people and you're like, oh, right? That's who's there. But I also wanted to comment on the kind of writing, and you're talking about the sister in the church. It's so exciting to think about that, and I can really connect that to all these quote-unquote folk artists, these women, Sister Gertrude Morgan and others, who are really doing that same kind of work, maybe not in a church and giving it away, but it's that same kind of impetus, and even up to David Hammonds, who one of his books has spirit writing. I mean, he's really interested in that. So there's, and then connecting it also to this, what I'm thinking about for the moment as this kind of surrealist automatic writing. So there's all these streams that kind of come into play to think about what's going on with that. One, the automatic writing is the kind of psychic surrealist, but what you're talking about is the spirit writing, which is a spiritual thing, and I think they all connect in there. And it's just fascinating to think about him being in these clubs that are all sorts of stuff going on, people high as kites, whatever, and I love it.
Spiritual. It's really spiritual.
Yeah, because you're at that higher level of
the ecstatic,
right?
The ecstatic. Yeah, and I think you bringing in that particular group of artists is so important because I think my kind of first read of Thompson's work was, okay, we can talk about the old masters all day, but where's the conversation around Bill Traylor? Where's the conversation around Clementine Hunter? And all of these Black artists from the South that I think in some ways paved the way for his work. I mean, we can think about Milton Avery, but I think it's important to sort of bring back the simple yet complicated, I think, works that these people were making and how these were documents of their everyday life. Thinking about how fable and allegory were so important to their work. And also, I think what I always find interesting in Thompson's work is, you know, the introduction of animals. It's not just a collective of humans, you know, in these compositions, but there are birds and dogs and horses and mules that are also in many moments being sort of complicit in the act that's taking place, whether it's, you know, sexual, violent, playful, etc. And that always sort of brings me back to an agrarian South, a Black agrarian South. Yeah. Where do we go from there? I think, well, we can also open it up to questions pretty soon. But I guess I'm just very curious, like, this is a very simple question. Do either of you have a favorite work of his, and why? Because I think even though he made work for only 8 years, the span of like experimentation and technique and the various tools he was using and how voraciously he was studying other artists is so prevalent, I think, year to year. And so what feels like a lifespan of work and is actually only 8 years is something that I would call truly prolific. And so I'm curious if there's one particular work that really resonates with either of you.
I'll have to say Leroy Jones and his family. I signed it. That's an easy one. And usually I do not say I have a favorite work ever with an artist, but I think if I don't say that, it'll be terrible. The other one would be Garden of Music, of course, with all those players. But that's why I also, you know, in teaching Thompson, I always compare him to Basquiat because it's that same, you know, almost the same lifespan as an artist, and just you know, this kind of frenetic, just work all the time, and so many works that in a short period of time, and the kind of meteoric rise and all that. So yeah, and we're glad that they actually did that.
I want to ask you a question about that real quick. I don't have a favorite piece because I'm still sort of experiencing his work. And it would be, I think, I haven't seen enough of his work in person. I've seen a lot of it sort of on print, but I haven't seen enough of it in person to be able to make that kind of determination. I haven't sat, because one of the things that maybe isn't a thing that I said, but I probably took it out. It was in the, you have to, I elaborated that I think that his work is also calling for a certain kind of sustained sort of sitting with. It feels, a lot of the work feels like I do say that there's a temporal shifting in terms of trying to play with the audiences, when playing with the audience's expectations for what a painting is supposed to be. I think it also is sort of challenging notions of temporality, and I haven't had the kind of slow time to sit and really be with. I would probably still resist the question of favorite, but I'm not resisting it as much as I feel like I can't answer it in the kind of way that would do it justice. But I did want to ask a question about the frenetic pace of creation, because the project that I'm working on now is about like musicians in the 80s and the 90s in Black churches who are also queer and contracting HIV, and are also creating at this kind of quick pace, and they're all dying in like 10 years. And like you have these musicians who are also creating in such a way that between like 1980 and like 1991, it's like 5 albums, which is a lot because you can't record on your computer like you can now. And so like they're actually doing these large productions yearly, which takes a lot of energy, a lot of resources. And I'm just wondering, it's just a curiosity, like what do you have a sense for? Because I don't. Do you have a sense for what the impetus for that kind of intensity of creation is for Thompson? Is like, is it partially response to his father's life and the tragedy, or like what are
I mean, I don't know. I mean, you know, in art history and art training, you're never supposed to speak about biography. But I always break the rule because I think the context of Black artists is important. Really? Because no, we're not Jackson Pollock. No, you know, we're not Dali or whomever. You know, and you want to think about, you know, also in his case, the constraints of segregation. Yeah. You know, and I've talked about this with other people. Elizabeth Catlett, you know, taking her class. She's teaching at Dillard, and she's born and raised in D.C. She works at historically Black college, Louisiana, in New Orleans. The only time she can take her students to the museum is when it's closed on Mondays, right? Because this is in segregation. You can't get in. And then the museum, New Orleans Museum of Art now, is in the middle of the park, and the park is segregated. You can't even walk in there as a Black person, period, any time of day or night. So what does she do? She gets a bus to take them to the step of the museum so they can actually go. Yeah. And they see Picasso's Guernica, and one of the people is Samela Lewis, who is part of that class. So that kind of context for being an artist, you know, he becomes an artist, you know, right after 1954, Brown v. Board, when these things are supposedly struck down. But you know, tradition, custom as it is, you know, still makes it difficult. He comes to the East Coast. So I think part of it is that. Part of it is who he is, and you know, the time, you know, where he is in the century and how that affects him, where he's from. Jack Whitten talked about it, you know, not being able to, you know, one day, you know, he's from Bessemer, Alabama. He looks in the window of the library, the white library that actually has books, unlike the Black library. And he tells his mother, and she like goes off and says, never do that again. You'll die if you even look in the white library that has books. I mean, you know, that kind of experience growing up, you're going to make a lot of stuff because finally you want to express some of that perhaps and then move through it and move on. But having said all of that, you can still find artists today that work incessantly. And I'm thinking of Whitfield Lavelle is one of these people that just, sometimes people are just like that. They're just working all the time.
Okay, we'll open it up to questions. And I think we have people coming down with mics.
Hello, I'm Douglas Jameson.
Hi, Douglas.
Hello.
You may have just mentioned one name, Whitfield Lavelle. I see part of Bob Thompson's success was in being referential or riffing off of past artists. Are there contemporary artists that in prominence, or do you think should be more prominent, that are referencing or riffing off of Bob Thompson's work or masterworks? And do you have recommendations in further exploring a certain artists?
There was a New York Times article that was actually really wonderful, that featured a few artists and scholars and curators sort of commenting on the influence of Bob Thompson's work when this show first started. One of those artists was Naudeline Pierre, who's an artist living in New York who creates these really whimsical, lush paintings of angels and biblical figures and mythical figures in different sort of moments of repose. So I thought that that was interesting that she sort of commented on Thompson and thinking about all the various humans and human creatures in his work. You could see a sort of family tree there. So that's just someone who comes to mind.
I'll leave that to y'all.
Any other questions?
Did he express his addiction at all as a force?
No, he didn't. And I think that's why I did that presentation, because I started off with a quote from him that talks about, that he really wanted to express his interiority in his own private way. And so that's why I think these recurring figures that you see throughout his work, while they are potentially commenting on the social times of the day in the 1960s, they're also deeply personal, and they're stand-ins for people in his life that have moved him in any sort of direction. I think, it's difficult to talk about addiction, and I think, personally, I wasn't entirely sure if I wanted to even bring that up, but I think it's actually important to talk about those things. I think it gives you a sense of the time. I think it gives you a sense of maybe partially how his work was created. And I think in talking about some of the more tragic events that happened in his life, I think it gives you a better understanding of some of the choices that he made around that. And I also wanted to note that I think the reason why it's difficult to talk about addiction, I think especially when in terms of Black artists, is because oftentimes that is sensationalized by the media, by critics, by others. And I've read so many different articles on Thompson that end with, and he died of a heroin overdose, when in fact that's not entirely true. And so I think my attempt was really sort of to give you an understanding of what this person may have been going through, and what he was working through.
I think for me, it was important to, and thank you for sending it to me, the speech when he was 12, because in that speech I really had a strong sense for the visual register of the thing that he was trying to describe, and it was both airy and really heavy. So for me, the ways that things like addiction are talked about with regards to art is almost like pathologizing to like, oh, or the reason why they create it is because of this. And for me, one of the important aspects of that speech is the will toward creation was already there, and it wasn't created by anything except him. And Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens is one of my favorite essays because I find it highly teachable, and it also continues to be an aha moment for me and my students. And it's like incredible that music is one of the things that's available for people who are Black that go to church. that music, but like people don't hand you paintbrushes in churches. And so one of the things I was trying to think about in this is like, well, what happens if you have this kind of audio-visual imagination that wants to do something like paint in a space where there is oratory sort of practice and there's this practice of musicality, but not necessarily a sort of visual register. What can one do? And I think what he does is he holds on to it through things like giving speeches, through his leadership practices. And that speech then for me becomes a generative way of entering into thinking about him as an artist that struggled with addiction, certainly, but also that was not reducible to his creation isn't reducible to that. His sort of his output. My question about like the pace of his output wasn't really about that. It's about like, is there a kind of sense of this world and its terribleness? And your answer is like, yeah, like if there's this kind of intensity with which you are living life because of a black or anti-black world, then of course, if you have things to say, you try to say those things in the various ways. So.
I wanted to ask a question. My name is Victoria. I'm not standing, sorry.
Hey, shout out to my Amherst alumni people. Victoria's one of them.
Amherst. So I wanted to really kind of think about a different context in terms of intensity. I mean, one of the American artists that was referenced was Pollock, but didn't he have like a whole factory of people that were working for him and with him and producing that art? I don't really know, but I'm asking, you know, if there was some kind of difference in the level of African American artists working individually or mentoring or helping each other to produce art that was not available to them as their contemporaries in American art that they're being compared to. I was just wondering about that.
You're confusing Pollock with Andy Warhol, who did have the factory. Yeah, but you're right, you know, and we can think of even going back to the old masters that Thompson is looking at. Some of them did have, you know, the workshop, you know. So yes, and I think, again, there's something I always point out because there's, and I think it's changing now as more people are writing and working and combining different practices like Ashon and really thinking about this stuff from different ways. That there had for many years been a kind of idea of belatedness with African American artists, with black artists. Oh, they just got to it 20 years later. That's why I showed that slide of, you know, Norman Lewis and Pollock, and the Lewis is actually earlier. And not to say that gotcha moment, but that part of that is because we have to think about, you know, de jure segregation up until, you know, the middle of the 20th century. And how do you, I mean, there's so many things we can think about, you know, the idea of even people before that not being able to look at the nude. I mean, that's one of the things you do, figure drawing in art school, right? But black people, you can't have a black man who's an artist in training looking at a nude white woman in a classroom. Not gonna happen. So how do you get that sense of the body? And that's something that I'm thinking about now. And they become their own models because they have to, because they can't do that publicly. Forget about even getting in school, because they get in because of the work, and then they show up at the school and they say, oh, we made a mistake, I'm sorry you didn't get in. So that's a whole generation that you can think about up to 1954. And then after that, which is when Thompson is active, and so many of these other people, you know, things change. And you can think of all the people now, somebody, you know, Kehinde Wiley, Micheline Thomas, Amy Sherrill, all these people have had a very, very different experience. And the world is now open to purchasing their work also. And so they're in a very different place, even younger artists, a sculptor named Hugh Hayden. Some of these artists are actually Mark Bradford. They're sponsoring other projects now. And, helping not just young artists, but young people to be able to be creative. But even in that before 1954, you had, people who were doing that. Augusta Savage teaches, Jacob Lawrence and others. So people were always doing that, but it wasn't funded the same way. They didn't have the same outlets for showing. There was still that uptown, downtown. And I think, since 1954 and that, getting over that, now you have a whole different history that you can write about. But we can't lose sight of what that was, for people to create.
We'll take one last question.
Hi, my name's Fred Aaron, also Amherst grad, from a long time ago. First of all, the changes in the art department at Amherst College have been incredible since I was there. That's another story. I was really, I don't know if you could call it, tickled or moved or blown away by the mention of slugs, because I was living down the street from Slugs, and that was my bar in the late 60s. And I didn't know this was going on at Slugs. But I do remember feeling that every time I went in there, which was never before 12, midnight, that there was a level of intimacy, of human connection, which doesn't always happen in places where people come and drink and play music, which is especially apparent to me because of a project I'm working on about a film called the Ash Grove, about a club that was here in Los Angeles in that time period. So my question is, that moment in history when a lot of these barriers were being not necessarily successfully broken down, but people were certainly chipping away at them with their axes, and saws and hammers. What is there about that particular period of time that was happening in the arts, music, painting, probably other arts also, which was I'm trying to find a way to express this, which was the entry into what was basically what became a new era, not always successfully, but it was like the opening of a door, and when I was looking at the paintings, I very much felt that same sense of human intimacy with what I saw in the paintings that I felt just walking into Slugs, hearing the music, sitting there, and also apparent in this other club, which was in Los Angeles in an entirely different context, but its main feature was making human contact. I'm not sure that's even a question.
Do you? I think it's a comment, but a good one. You know, Slugs was really important to Thompson, and what's interesting is in his papers, it actually talks about him and, you know, the musician Jackie McLean, and how in some ways Thompson was a part of the origins of Slugs. He created some of the first posters for some of the first shows there. And so what I love about Thompson is, you know, he's not just depicting these musicians. He's very much next to them, with them, feeling the music. And not only that, but his piece Bird Party, which is actually upstairs, was actually hung in Slugs for a bit and kind of functioned as a backdrop for some of the performers. And so I love this sort of reciprocity and exchange that he was doing with, you know, these fellow jazz musicians. But I think that intimacy that you're speaking to, and maybe I think in a larger part, the question you're asking about how these spaces united people, specifically people of different backgrounds, was that, I mean, I think in a very simple way, music, but in this case, jazz is like a sort of great equalizer, in that it brings people together and did bring people together there. I love looking at photographs of people in Slugs, and there's a really great one of him and Carol and A.B. Spellman and a group of people together. And you can just see by those images that anyone and everyone kind of showed up to that space. And it was a space of joy and fun and celebration. So, yeah. Okay, well, thank you guys so much. Really appreciate you coming here. Thank you. And I just wanted to briefly say that we have more programming around the show. In December, Taylor Renee Aldridge will be doing a gallery walkthrough in the galleries. And also we're collaborating with NTS Radio on a 3-part series around Bob Thompson. So the first one actually aired yesterday or 2 days ago. It's a 2-hour mix of jazz that was, you know, made during the time that he was in New York. And so, yeah, there's plenty of ways to follow that. Thank you guys again. Thanks.